YouTube channel. It helps if you hit the bell. It helps mitigate the kayfabe effect because we let you know when these new videos come out, so that if you see a comic that you might like that we're talking about, you're the first one to go to eBay, you're the first one to go to Amazon or your local comic shop to scoop up these comics. And if you watch these videos to the end, what happens is that helps us out by goosing the algorithm, pushes our video to other comics loving YouTube viewers who aren't yet familiar with the Cartoonist Kayfabe YouTube channel, and we've been growing our subscriber numbers that way. So Jimmy, one of the things that is very important to me as a creator, man. Like I need inspiration every day. Like you're fighting nature to sit down and just look at a blank white piece of paper and draw something and spend all your time by yourself doing that. I need to know that you work at the stuff long enough, man. Your craft and your facility is going to get stronger and stronger. And some of my favorite books are like the comic strip reprints, where I get to see day one of Chester Gold's Dick Tracy and the final day. Maybe you don't want to look at like that. Maybe a good sweet spot would be in the middle somewhere.
Yes, right.
You dig what I'm saying? The complete Crumb comics is important to me. And another set of comics that in terms of craft and facility, that is an inspiration to me, man, is watching the growth of Dave Sims' drawing ability over the years with Cerebus, man. This guy started doing this comic '77. At a certain point within the first, couple of years, is like, I think I'm gonna give this a go. It'll be 300 issues. At a certain point, I'm gonna do it on a monthly basis, and he fulfilled that. I was rooting for that dude when I was a kid, like when I was introduced to his stuff by way of Spawn, and he's in.
So I was watching some YouTube earlier today about comic books because there's an entire section of YouTube that talks about comic books. People talking about comics, dissecting comics. Cartoonist Kayfabe is my personal favorite choice for comic book discussion. I like what they have to say. I love when they discuss comic books. Sometimes they get deep into the minutia, like they do here on Dave Sims' Cerebus, and I'm all for it. Spend an hour talking about Spawn, a somewhat demonic superhero from Image Comics. Absolutely. Spend an hour listening to about Larry Hama and why G.I. Joe represents military industrial complex represented in plastic toys for kids, but makes it palpable. I'm all for it. Spend some time talking about this and that. I love to have that on. I don't like having the office quiet when I'm grading papers and grading discussion boards. I must always have a second monitor set up with some kind of video playing. And sometimes they're just talking about comics or manga or movies. Um, I was thinking about that though as I was approaching this comic, listening to this comic discussion, thinking about English 112. And in English 112 right now, we're thinking a lot about the play and Enemy of the People, the act play in 5 acts by Henrik Ibsen, the nature of hero. And I was really thinking about what's more important, the real world, the nonfiction, or the fiction, right? An interesting question that we may not have time to talk about in class, but I do think you should think about, and a question I think that you should ask your friends and families, your loved ones, your coworkers. What's more important to them, fiction or nonfiction? Think about the nature of fiction. It is making up reality, adding dragons to it. You know, people in soap operas having lives that look like lives, look like family dynamics, but are made up. They're just fake people. And then nonfiction, this historical record, right? So, what's more important, fiction or nonfiction? I find the current college to be quite interesting sometimes. I'm always slightly confused by it at times. When I was a student decades ago, it didn't really matter what you wanted to be when you grew up. You had to take literature classes. You would take these literature classes, you would talk about literature, you would study literature, and it almost exclusively dealt with fiction. It did not matter if you wanted to be an English major, a teacher, a nurse, a doctor, a lawyer, a construction worker. If you wanted a college degree, you spent time thinking about literature because every person needed literature to be a well-rounded person. You needed literature and understand literature and to move through literature to be a fully developed thinker. Somewhere along the line, though, that has actually fallen away. I have known English professors quite well that I have a lot of respect for that don't want to teach literature anymore, not fiction literature. They're just done teaching the fake world. They'd rather talk about the nonfiction reality. So it's interesting, even in my own department, in my own kind of sphere of English teacher colleagues, those kind of discussions of what is most important, the fiction or the non-fiction. I know how I end up on that, but how do you end up on that? Popular opinion, sometimes people say that the nonfiction is more important because it is real and that fake people's lives and problems and drama might be fun as a distraction, but they're not real. Real people, real suffering is really important. That's kind of one opinion, I suppose. The polar opposite of that opinion, because there's always a polar opposite, the polar opposite of that opinion, of course, is that fiction is most important. Real life is messy. Real life's hard to figure out, but fiction is where we can have these thoughts in a safe way and figure these things out. So, kind of thinking about the three audiences, and that every idea breaks into three audiences of for and against, and that kind of middle point. Where are you? Are you in either of those two polar extremes? Or are you somewhere in the middle, as most people usually are? Where are your family, your friends, your colleagues, your coworkers, your those people you respect and love and hate, have to work with anyway? Where are they at? Yeah, where are you on fiction, nonfiction? That's an important thing about as the class is talking about a play by Henrik Ibsen from the 1800s. Quite an old work of fiction at this point. It feels like it could be real. It feels like it could be true, but it's still, fiction. Um, when you're talking about what's more important, fiction and nonfiction, also think about not only what do you think the answer should be, but also what do you invest your time in? When you go home at night after a hard day of work or hard day of class, do you immediately plug yourself into the news headlines and the reality of unfolding situations? Yeah, Russian threat identifying, intensifying, rolling into major Ukrainian cities. Are you thinking about the politics and ramifications of that? Are you wondering now what Biden is going to do in the State of the Union, he's already kind of thrown his hat in with NATO? If NATO sides against Russia, then Biden seems like he will, in some scale, also side against Russia. Are you thinking about the political ramifications of Russia and China already declaring a year or two ago that they would have each other's backs in any kind of potential conflict? If you picked up war with one of them, you'd have to fight them both. Politically, we may wind up with Russia and China at war with the entirety of NATO. The entire world could be at war again. Is that the reality you sink yourself into, kind of flipping through the headlines? Lots of that in this current moment. As I record this in March 1st, 2022, I can see why that is dominating the headlines a little bit. Also, I can see if I flip stations, we still get a lot of Russia from a different station, different kind of headline, but very similar concerns being mimicked. Or are we just going to go home and look at space wizards and superheroes and not worry about that for a little while? Maybe our day was already rough and tough, and we just need to relax with a little bit of fiction. And so think about that too. Where do you spend most of your time, in fiction worlds or nonfiction worlds? Not where do you live. Obviously, you live in a nonfiction world, unless you're a Disney park character, which then I suppose would live in a fantasy world because you're Captain Caveman, 12 hours a day. But most of us live in a nonfiction world, sure. But where we invest our time, our thoughts, our energies, when we go home and start reading books and picking up things to read, and we start looking at Twitch streamers to Twitch with and to interact with and drop our chat dollars with, we're looking at different kinds of media that we interact with. We're lining up around the block opening night of the new documentary about nonfiction, because nonfiction is the most important part of our lives. And so we're going to drop our dollars and our hard earned time into going to the theaters to watch the nonfiction and to find a new documentary about a crisis somewhere. Or are we just going to drop our money and our time into watching more space wizards do space battle things because that seems fun? When you're thinking about that question, and it's a hard question at its core, it's supposed to be a tricky question. It's an unresolved question for many people. It makes a nice conversation because it's not an easy thing to resolve. What is more important, fiction or nonfiction? Many people that will tell you nonfiction will spend a considerable amount of time, I suppose, in the news and in history books and in documentaries, but they also seem to enjoy their space wizards and their reality TV shows, which are highly edited until they're no longer fiction. That rose, those glistening, highly waxed up bodies don't represent any kind of reality at that point. You've shoved celebrities into a room and threatened not to feed them until they win immunity idols. That's not the real world. We edited that completely. The cooking show challenges. The challenges all end at different times, are judged independently over a 3 hour time. They just hype it up to make it look like they're all ending the next 3 minutes to get the countdown clock, right? You got to be able to see the fiction within your nonfiction. But similarly, you need to be able to see the nonfiction in your fiction. And so we get back to something like Enemy of the People, play in 5 acts by Henrik Ibsen, adapted later by American playwright Arthur Miller. We're looking at a fictionalized world and a worldview. All we know about the characters, their backgrounds, their motivations are on the page or screen in front of us. If we're reading it in a play, or if we found a YouTube video to read along as YouTube, some high school somewhere is doing a Enemy of the People on stage, so we can kind of keep track of the characters better and kind of know who's lying and what they sound like, whatever. Um, it's a fake world with fake stakes and fake possibilities, but it sounds really real in the same way that many people think reality television is real and nonfiction, despite the heavy hand of the editor manipulating the situation. Some of those even have scripts involved. Sometimes editors give the scripts to the contestants. Sometimes the editors are just looking to maintain the script without the contestants' knowledge. In that same way, we have this non-fiction reality of politicians and scientists butting heads, but played out in a family drama that seems like it could happen. It seems like stakes that are real to the real world. And very often, there's a movement between the two. When we think about an Enemy of the People, I often like to talk about Flint, Michigan. Flint, Michigan is one of the larger cities in Michigan. Michigan's largely a rural state in the central United States. A couple of big cities like Flint, a couple of big cities like Detroit, but largely fairly rural and wooded and pristine and probably gorgeous, quite honestly. Some decades ago, the population of Flint, Michigan was expanding, and they had to redo the water lines, and they of course used the cheapest water lines possible, which was fine until the chlorine, acceptable chlorine levels changed. Of what most cities, municipalities put chlorine into the water to clean it up, to kill the bacteria, to make sure it's safe to drink, which is all well and good unless you throw it in really cheap pipes, and now those are rusting, corroding, and leaching minerals and metal into the water supply, and actually your cleaner is now making it more corrosive and harder to drink. And then once that's saturated at a point, you can take the chlorine out, but it's still just leaching things in your water supply. Flint, Michigan has been in the news for decades now, it seems like, because of their bad water, right? And so a lot of people look at Flint, Michigan, bad water, and then this Enemy of the People, bad water. And they start realizing that there are activists with science trying to save the people of Michigan, save the people, particularly of Flint. That seemed very much like Dr. Stockman. But they also start looking at those headlines and start looking at that and realize there's a lot of politicians, a lot of corporate pushback, a lot of people in power that would rather keep the status quo than to challenge breaking the economy of an already struggling city. And that, yes, it'd be lovely if we could redo all the pipes and fix all the water, but the city just cannot do that. Maybe we just need to not talk about it. Maybe we just need to make sure the local newspapers and media is just not discussing it and not making people paranoid about something that's outside of our control, feasibly and economically. And to start looking at kind of your list of characters and who you think a hero is in Flint, Michigan, you can find that scientists set, right? You can also find the politics and the politicians set. And it makes a pretty easy corollary between these two things. You can take something like COVID and look at Dr. Fauci, who was making headlines a few years ago with the onset of the pandemic, trying to keep us in lockdown and keep us in using some science-based methods to separate ourselves, things that seem to work well in other parts of the world, but America doesn't really buy into and didn't really adopt completely and fully, and maybe that made the difference. You also had people like Trump that thought the economy needed to be preserved no matter how many people we needed to die along the way. They'd probably be elderly and uninsured and sort of, riffraff anyway. Just let them die. It may be your parents, your grandparents, your aunts and uncles, but just let them die and the economy will keep on kicking. You don't want to challenge that economy, right? And so it's possible to look at that too and start seeing this kind of global pandemic, but played out very much like the play, Enemy of the People. And so a year or two ago when I was teaching this at the onset of the pandemic, nearly everyone, when they were assigned a paper, find a hero, identify a hero in the play, enemy the people, and find a real world uh, corollary in a recent event, but not use Flint, Michigan, because I make it Flint, Michigan into examples from time to time. Well, a lot of people wrote me COVID papers, right? Got lots of COVID papers. Lots of the hero is Dr. Stockman because he speaks the truth. And therefore, Fauci is also a hero in this real world situation. Um, also had a lot of people write the other side of that paper that Peter Stockman, the mayor, the politician, is trying to protect the people and guard the economy and give them better lives, just like Trump is, right? So I've read a lot of those papers. I've read a lot of Flint, Michigan papers a generation before that. I've read a lot of COVID papers. The task in front of you is to first read the play, understand the play, find a hero in the play, figure out what makes that hero heroic, set that up. Sure. Then you've got to take and find a real world scenario. One of the saddest things about teaching an enemy of the people is that for the entirety of my career, I can teach this and I can always flippantly say, go find a real world example, not Flint, Michigan, that is fairly recent and use it. And there will always be something fairly recent that they can use. Obviously, COVID is fairly popular, and many of you will write COVID papers because we're still living in the middle of that reality, and why not? You won't use Flint, Michigan because it tells you not to, but water problems are not new. You can look at water problems in tainted water in Peru. You can look at water problems in Southwest Asia. You can look at different air quality problems in China versus LA versus Mexico City, and how governments and activists are fighting to save the population from bad air, while the politics and economy may not be trying to prevent bad air. Even if we have things like Earth Day and environmental laws, we're still cleaning the air at a slower rate than somewhere like China that decided to clean the air. So they did it. They cleaned the air. They planted trees. They tore down houses and widened roads so the carbon monoxide wouldn't build up inside the cities. Um, and they started planting more trees. When you walk down the city streets in any Chinese city, you're always under the trees. It helps keep the heat off of you. It helps also clean all of the trash out of the air. That many trees just makes a giant difference. You start looking at the cities with the highest pollutants and worst air quality anywhere in the world. We also have the least amount of trees. One of the reasons that Charlotte has fared better is because it was once called the Tree City. It's not as treed as it once was, but also didn't have as many steel factories as Pittsburgh did. Pittsburgh, when they slowed down the steel manufacturing, but also started replanting trees, they were able to re-see the Pittsburgh skyline, which was missing for a couple decades there. Right? You could go for that. You could go for anything, really. There's a lot of topics. It is currently 2022. I'm currently sitting in my office after class one day, thinking about possible topics. Obviously, COVID and Flint, Michigan are in there. Someone asked about the laws in Texas. Texas has been in the politics, and Texas politics has been in the news a lot lately. Texas is trying to ban abortions and defund potential abortion clinics, which has political opinions and controversy built into it. But besides the apparent controversy of babies, live babies, what is a fetus, what is a zygote, what is a child, that kind of classic. You also have to keep in mind that a lot of the doctors that are being defunded because they might possibly let you have an abortion are also the cheapest and most affordable places for healthcare for women to get mammograms and pap smears. We could see a surge in low income female cancers because of this in the future. There's that side of that too, right? Just somebody was asking about the Texas law. My mind went automatically to abortion and right to reproduce, the right to say no. Can you functionally get rid of a child or not? Can you functionally have a child or be forced to have a child? My mind went there. When somebody said Texas, my mind went there. So I started explaining that yes, that would work. Texas abortion laws, and in Texas you are mandated that you must now have a child. Abortions are now illegal for the most part, basically. It's nuanced, but in a short English class, quick summary, that sounds like that's probably what is true. My mind also went to the fact that they're also defunding education and healthcare and welfare, and so you are forced to have a child that no one's going to help you raise, educate, feed. That sounds lovely. And my mind starts racing to who the heroes are in the situation and who the villains are in the situation, and I wind up in a very definite camp. Um, Politically, my mind was racing. I was there, like, sure, yeah, Texas, that works. The student that brought this up said, no, not that law in Texas, another law in Texas. Now, they were concerned about the transgender law in Texas, which is a little bit more recent. They were banning abortions a good 6 months ago. That's old news, apparently. Student was watching the news lately and was this whole transgender issue was interesting to them. So they were kind of paying attention to that. Now it's illegal to be transgender in Texas, basically. If you are raising a transgender youth, the parents can be arrested, fined, and arrested for child abuse. And the fun part of that is every teacher and medical official that does not report those parents when they see a transgender child can also be punished, fined, fired, and jailed for child abuse. So it's now illegal to be non-binary in Texas. It's kind of the quick answer of that, right? Um, but yeah, that'd work. There's heroes and there's villains in that story. However you think politically about that and that topic, there's heroes and villains in that story. Now it's complicated when you get into those heroes and villains. And a lot of times real life is complicated. When we get into looking at the fiction, it's really easy to tell the good guys from the bad guys, right? I think when we get into something like Enemy of the People, I think Ibsen wanted a particular character to be the protagonist and be the hero of the story. I think that the ending and what that ending means is a result of how it resolves for that one particular character. As we know, thinking about Ibsen's other plays, the audience does not always see the play the same way Ibsen does. And in fact, thinking about other fiction works, um, like the Marvel Universe, there are quite compelling reasons that Thanos was not actually a villain. Thanos was allowed to have so much logic and so much gravitas and so much screen time, not just be the maniacal rich person that wants to blow up the world because they're rich and they can, or a mad, crazed clown that wants to burn down the world because they can. It's funny. Thanos had a point. Thanos wanted to find balance and harmony and make life sustainable and realized that overburdening the system was killing our planet and all planets. And if we could just reset it, we could make it a better world. And functionally creates a paradise for 5 years in the Marvel Universe timeline. Life is good. War is bad, on the decrease. We don't need to fight for resources anymore. Now we had to flip out of existence and blip out of existence half the population, which took out your parents and your grandparents and your kids you grew up with that you thought were cute in high school, whatever. Besides that, it works, right? And so there's a lot of people that would go around the bathrooms and subways of a Marvel world going, Thanos was right. A lot of graffiti in the New York skyline post Thanos. Thanos was right. It's one of my favorite parts of the Hawkeye television show is when he's trying to use the bathroom and he's looking at the graffiti that says Thanos had a point. Thanos was right. Thanos. Same things happens when you get your space wizards. Life is complicated. Movies are easy. Good guys and bad guys. I think we're all supposed to identify with the Rebel Alliance in the Star Wars trilogy, sextology, octology, septology. It was this Star Wars cinematic universe 20 movies later, 5 or 6 TV shows, this giant world of Star Wars. I think we're supposed to think that the rebels are cool and that the empire is bad. But there are a lot of people that realize that the empire has stability and order and the stability of the entire galaxies and universes, and that they're bringing peace, harmony. Sure, they've enslaved all the robots. Robots aren't really people. Sure, they've enslaved several planets full of slightly humanoid looking animals that can talk and are sentient and have parties. But whatever, they're not quite human. That's fine. Sure, they've enslaved all the clones, but clones aren't necessarily people. They're just fleshy robots. It's fine. Don't worry about it. Meanwhile,